Thank you to each of the panelists. That was amazing. My heart is pounding, my brain is whizzing, and I'm very excited. I want to say that as a society, I think we're sick, okay? I think we're sick from social and political isolation, let alone the literal sicknesses that many of us experience. I think we're dealing with physical isolation from consumer citizenship and alienation, a kind of alienation, okay? That's really complex, and that is a very real set of issues that we need to face in our understanding of the next system. So, I deeply support the solidarity economy. I deeply support ideas such as urban housing, residential community land trusts, and cooperatives. And I think that those models get us toward facing the reality of alienation that each of us faces. But I think that we're not necessarily getting to the problem of alienation at the core, where we're not facing that many of us, all of us, have a dearth of play or pleasure, self-awareness, coping skills in our lives, ways of knowing ourselves and therefore others, abilities to work through angst, the kind that Frederick Durkheim was trying to figure out, how do we prevent, the kind of alienation that leads to suicide, right? I'm not trying to pull us to this wild existential level, but at the same time, I'm trying to say, if you were going to talk to your buddies back in your hometown, I think we have to start at the level of sort of this interpersonal, internal violence that each of us experiences, that then we foist out into our various spaces, which then reflect back upon us. So this idea of solidarity towards changing or producing the next system through various means, I think has to be predicated on learning how to thrive together, how to live together, how to rely on each other, and how to love in public. I know Cornel West has coined that, as love in public means, just public policies, but I do not think we have a clue of how to do this. Now, for some people and cultures and societies, they rely on religion to help them understand this. This is one of the puzzles that Durkheim was trying to figure out. He said, well, he is no longer a practicing Jew, and he was raised in the Jewish community, but if you are not going to be relying on a religious community to help you understand how to love and how to be an ethical person in the world, what is going to help you do that? Commercials? What is going to help you figure out how to be in the world, which will provide the impetus toward moving into a solidarity economy? And this is the thing that I want to put on the table for the panelists. I know it's quite a difficult question or comment that I'm putting on. The last time I was in a conversation with Gar, I talked about how we don't have a theory of love in politics or in urban planning or in guerrilla gardening or whatever. We have no theory of love. We don't even understand what it is. Okay, so that's my first point I want to put on the table for us to wrestle with. And then the second one is, I love solidarity economies, and I love this idea of cosmopolitan multiculturalism, okay? But at the same time, there's a lot of fakery. There's a lot of problems with this cosmopolitan multiculturalism that's a phrase that Michael Dumas, a friend of mine at Berkeley, a scholar at Berkeley, has used to denote the reluctance to face the racial liberalism and the racialized state that we not only have inherited, but that we work through. So if we were going to debate the pros and cons of a centralized system, how do we face the reality of the racialized liberalism that we're inheriting? What do we do? Because solidarity economies put forth a certain kind of model of cosmopolitan multiculturalism and sharing and caring is we're going to love our way through it, but that theory of love denies the reality, the inheritance, ignores rather, perhaps. I'm struggling with this because it's baked into our very bureaucracies. And I'll give you one really concrete example of how. In my dissertation, I was looking at community land trusts, and I wanted to understand why the big think tanks and the big foundations eschewed the smaller community land trusts, who happen to coincidentally be populated by people of color. Okay, so I wanted to understand this. Okay, and because the urban community land trust movement is very fascinating to me, so I went back all the way to the first one. The first one was started by Martin Luther King's cousin, Slater King. And how was it started? He and others went to Jerusalem. Why? Because they wanted to study kibbutzim. Why? Because the Jewish National Fund, right, which puts out the blue boxes at many synagogues and Jewish schools throughout the world to collect money to help fund territorial politics in Jerusalem, right? So Slater King, Martin Luther King's cousin, comes back to the United States and he says, boom, what we need to do is adopt this model in the South and start our first Black cooperative farm. And it failed. So none of the National Community Land Trust thinkers and advocates ever talk about this failed CLT. They don't talk about it. Why did it fail? Racial liberalism at the level of governance, right? The Department of Agriculture and the Department of Housing negated loans to this first CLT. In fact, a major lawsuit was recently won. So this story, I offer this story to say that I cannot tell you how excited I am about CLTs and the solidarity community. And at the same time, my research shows that the racism is so deeply baked into our bureaucracies that if we don't face it head on, we will relive Slater King's experience over and over again. Not to be overly cynical. So I would like to ask the panelists to wrestle a little bit with these comments, and then I would like to put out to the audience to submit questions to the panel. Thank you very much. Who would like to start? Thank you.
Good questions. So to your first question about how do we work together? How do we, solidarity and love, I believe absolutely that is in our nature. But it can also be really, really hard. So, I wear the other hat. I'm the coordinator of this national network, but I also work on the ground in Springfield, as was mentioned, building this network. So we built on the Evergreen model, but we're much smaller. We don't have a Cleveland Foundation at our heart. So we really had to, just build it by finding allies wherever we could. So we have one cooperative that's been up and running for a little over 2 years. It's an upholstery cooperative, and it's doing well. We have 6 workers right now. It's profitable. My role there, one of my roles there is I do the training, the cooperative management training, and I also do the HR. So when there's a problem, I'm there in the mix, trying to mediate, trying to figure out, trying to do trainings around how to communicate. I tell you, it is tough, right? Because it's tough to work together. We don't know necessarily how to do that very well. We don't learn it, we don't practice it. So you come in a workplace with people that don't have that background, and it's tough. And then you have class and you have racial different cultures clashing and assumptions that are made about each other. It's tough. That's all I can say, really. It's tough, and you have to work at it. And you have to, we have meetings and we have these honest conversations, and sometimes there isn't a silver bullet. There was one person that it really ended up leaving, not because his skills were not okay, but because it was just not We just couldn't get over some of these conflicts and assumptions and barriers. I wish we could have. We didn't in that case. We try every day, but it's tough, and it's something that, I mean, I don't know if there is a theory, if there is if there's a kind of a great set of curricula or practices or something that get people there, but some of it, I think it's case by case, personality by personality, situation by situation, trying to figure out how to build that common vision so that instead of suspicion and, sort of lashing out, especially when the pressure is on, there's more trust. You build that trust. You build that willingness to work together and reach an honest understanding. But it's work. I have no magic bullet for that. As for the sort of racialized reality of our country, so Solidarity Economy absolutely always says that if Solidarity Economy is not relevant and is not workable in marginalized segments of our population, in marginalized low income or communities of color, then we're not building a solidarity economy. And so, first of all, it just needs to be front and center, right? And then second of all, in practice, right, you need a real conscious plan and strategy, and you need to talk about it every step of the way to say, how do you make sure that this isn't just blossoming in, white, affluent, well-educated communities? And for many practices, that's what will happen if you aren't conscious and deliberate and strategic. But the good news is there's a lot of solidarity economy practices that are growing up in communities of color and amongst marginalized people. So one of the fastest growing areas of worker co-ops is immigrant women cooperatives, and they're doing very well. The largest worker cooperative is the Cooperative Home Care Associates in the Bronx. Right? Most of the women were at one time or another on some kind of social welfare, mostly women of color. So there is, in many areas, there are very conscious strategies and deliberate initiatives to make sure that the solidarity economy doesn't just end up sort of ghettoized in communities of privilege. So yeah, I think it's an important, really, really important point to keep front and center.
Thank you.
When we last talked about this, I've been thinking about it more deeply than before, and I don't think I have a final answer, but it's very clear that the issue of community would be another way, or you use the language of love, but of respect would be another term, is central to the question of building the post-socialist, the communist vision of a community, and it really, I think it requires us to think in stages and in evolution as well, because the pressures so many people are under, forcing them to hold on tight to what they've got, are real. And fear is real, and discrimination is real, in the sense that you get into an arrangement with people and you're going to get screwed is real. There's a lot of this in ordinary experience. So that the evolution of communal structures, co-ops, for instance, or land trusts, which are very hard to do, because by the time you get to your land trust, the developer's been there before you. As soon as you see, we've seen this in many communities, as soon as you begin to say, how do we stabilize the community, a land trust being one way to get control of the land prices, the developers smell prices and increases faster than you do, and they've got more money to go in. So we're beginning to see experiments that might take that on in some communities, about 140 of them that we've seen, some rural, some urban, that are beginning to try to get ahead of the game. But it's particularly hard because it fragments the community. As soon as those prices go up, bam, you're out of there, and you lose the community, and the fear goes with it. So I think what my way of beginning to think about it is that the slow and agonizing stabilization of communities and the agonizing building of the solidarity economy is part and parcel of the reconstruction of community and of a vision of relationships that is different. And another piece of it, which we never dealt with on the left successfully, the anarchists played with it in a serious way, but they never got to the question of structure, is you can't have community unless there is stability of individual security, meaning liberty. That's never been strong point of the socialist left in structural terms. Now, what are the preconditions of giving people enough stability so they can reach out and love, if you like, or create structures that take risk? And that is a real requirement. The only place we see people who have that is faculty tenure, where you get tenure, you have security. In theory, you could do something with it. Often you just do careerism. Yeah. But it is, or a guaranteed annual income would be another way to give enough stability for individuals so that you can build community. So I'm going to urge that point, that to get community, you need more security for individuals. It's part and parcel of that struggle. Now I'm talking about design and systemic design and making sure that the conditions of community and liberty are possible. In the struggle, now it is reaching out in forms, trying with co-ops, with community organizing, trying to build in more respect. Those are all preliminary, agonizing attempts. And I think that's part of the struggle, and particularly the racial issue. Unless that is dealt with, and I think we're beginning to see people trying to deal with it in a genuine way at the local level in some communities. Really trying to do that is part and parcel of the bigger struggle. And look, this particular system was built on racism. Yes. That isn't the case in all systems. The depth of racism in this country was designed. I mean, that's part and parcel of how they organize it. So you're dealing not only with racial attitudes, you're dealing with the whole structure of how the system was built and how the exploitation system was built. So it is at the heart of the American problem, as opposed, for instance, to the Swedish problem, where that's not central to their development. All I can say is that these are the pieces of the puzzle that I think, in an evolutionary way, we've got to begin putting more and more together, and part and parcel of the overall struggle.
Okay, Shama, do you want to? Sure. Do you need the microphone?
First of all, Mia, on your point about alienation, I think you put it in a very poignant manner, and it's alienation under capitalism is at many levels, and it's intense, and it's all pervasive, and there's no question about that. But I think if we're going to talk about what is that future going to look like that could end that alienation, then we have to also analyze what alienation looks like for different sections of, human beings, working people, I would say, under capitalism. I mean, alienation for just a regular working person who may have a decent standard of living right now in the United States is bad enough. Whether they're aware of it or not, they're experiencing it. And a lot of the ills of society, the depression levels, if you look at how much there's a drug overdose, accidental drug overdose deaths, suicide rates, if you look at all the social conditions that people are experiencing, whether they realize it or not, they are all, living the consequences of alienation, and there's no question about it. But imagine how much more pronounced it is when you look at very specifically oppressed people, and you mentioned the question of black people, people of color, racially oppressed people, and I think that it's not. This is why I don't think that we can resolve this situation globally by talking about cooperatives only, because while I completely agree with everything that's been done, and as I said before, I find that I see glimmers of hope through that, because I see the possibilities of what could happen globally. But my point is that if we talk about all the people, if our goal is to end oppression for everybody, and I'm assuming that's our goal, then we have to talk about international solidarity, and we have to talk about what life is like for the most oppressed people. And these are not people who are just minority of people in the fringes. I mean, if you look at what Michelle Alexander talked about in the new Jim Crow, she talks about how there are 2 million people incarcerated in the United States today, and that's more people than were under slavery or impacted under Jim Crow, and the vast majority of them are black and brown people, and they never had a chance. If you read especially what Chris Hedges writes, Chris Hedges has visited prisons, he teaches in prisons, he'll talk about how 14-year-old black boys who had nothing to do with a crime that happened, they were just caught up in the system, and there you go, bam, you have a 70-year sentence without any hope of parole. And that has happened to hundreds of thousands of people. That is, I mean, if you want to talk about alienation, that is complete and utter alienation without any hope of resurrection. And so if we are going to talk about that, not to mention the alienation that is being expressed by extremely vast swaths of humanity on every continent, especially the neo-colonial countries, we are talking about billions of people who are experiencing deep oppression under global capitalism. So my question would be, how can we only use the idea of cooperatives and say that let's have an agonizing start towards that without actually including them in the struggle? And I say this, because of material realities. When you talk about the many, as I said, billions of people, these people have nothing. They have nothing to use in order to set up a cooperative. Their only hope is actually to carry out a massive political struggle against the oppressors. And so that has to be a necessary part of what they do. And I would also challenge ourselves in thinking about what is the evolution, what could be the evolution of cooperative, the idea of cooperatives, without attaching to it the idea of political struggle. Just take the example of Whole Foods. I want to give a couple of examples. One is, when in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when the whole question of food became more and more clear to, the middle class people who had access to that knowledge and who could do something about it, they set up for organic food co-ops. That was the origin of organic food, the whole organic food revolution in the United States, to those who have access to it and who can afford it. But what happened even there, when those food co-ops that were set up by community people who didn't want to make profits, they just thought it was a good idea to give clean, healthy food access to people who could afford it, those co-ops did not remain co-ops. They got sort of eaten up by Whole Foods. I mentioned Whole Foods because there was one, big example of corporate sort of taking over of an idea that worked. And so what I would posit is that, one, if we want these ideas to work for all of humanity, then they have to be expanded to a large scale. But there are barriers to expanding it because there are material barriers. When people have nothing, what are they going to set up cooperatives with? And secondly, if they do, in fact, if those ideas do become successful, they become more dangerous to capitalism, because capitalism is not going to allow, capitalist class is not going to allow great examples of worker cooperative without any profit making to succeed without challenging it. So now, if you look at the biggest purveyors of so-called organic food, it's not even Whole Foods, it's Kraft Foods, Walmart, the most giant corporations who are not only purveyors of this so-called organic food, they are purveyors of the worst standards of living and the worst kinds of oppression for women and people of color. Look at the living standards of people who work at Walmart. How are we going to resolve these large questions without talking about a political struggle? And the other point I would add to this discussion is also that, I personally would like to be the harbinger. I would like to bring a message of hope, meaning it is possible to harness the technology and the wealth of society, which is immense, for the good of humanity, but in a very specific way. What I mean is delivering high standards of living, access to technological advances to everybody, but in a way that enhances their standards of living, their quality of life. I'll just give you one very simple example. Washing machines are a very simple invention that are now really well developed and are very accessible to people in the first world. But if you look at what's happened, again, in all those continents that they don't have access to these things, It's not because they don't have access to washing machines, not because it's somehow an esoteric technology. They don't have access to it because it can't happen under this system that they will have access to it. So you have hundreds of millions of women doing back-breaking drudgery every single day, even though the technology is already available. So if we are to hold forth a vision of society, I want to hold forth a vision not of a Luddite community which in order to remain pure in its bubble will forsake cell phones, will forsake cars, will forsake everything else. I mean, I want mass transit preferably, not cars, but that's still technology. But how are we going to do it? How can I be a member of a cooperative when I have a cell phone which I know can only be manufactured with deep oppression and exploitation of people in Africa? I mean, if we're going to resolve all those questions, then I think this is a great starting point. But at the end of the day, without international mass movements and political struggle against the power brokers, we're not going to really move to that direction.
I just want to add just a short comment. So we talk about resist and build. Solidarity economy absolutely embraces, believes in, makes common cause with, sees as part of it building resistance, building movement. So it's not an either or. Absolutely, solidarity economy recognizes the importance of everything that you say. So I was just getting the feeling like maybe it was feeling a little bit like there was a divide here. I don't feel like there is. On the other hand, I think that political struggles that are struggling against the powers that be, that also aren't clear about what is the alternative, is also not as strong as when you marry the two. And so solidarity economy, while believing in both, that you need both legs, the resist and the build, right? Solidarity economy is definitely stronger on focusing on the build because we see that the left in the US has been very strong in the resist, right? Very strong in the resist. We have a really good sense of what's wrong with capitalism. We have a really strong sense of all the evils of capitalism, corporations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? We know that. That battle has been going on fiercely for a long, 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 long time. What we don't have as clear a sense of, or we don't think we have as clear a sense of, but I think we're closer than we believe. Which is what are we for? And so, and what are the examples, the viable examples that we can point to that work? And so that imagine all those big corporations just poof. Just imagine if that happened. Are we actually ready? Do we actually have the skills? Do most people have the skills to actually run our vision of an economy? I would argue that we don't. So that's what the build part is about, that we need to develop that, we need to build our skills, we need to connect them, but we need the resist as well, and we need them working together.
So I think the conversation is getting even more rich, and really important issues are being put on the table. So I want to speak to some of the global questions, and the best way for me to speak about it is that I'm older than I look. Many years ago, I worked in the U.S. Senate for the leading environmental senator, Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day. And for a while, and I was there during the Gulf of Tonkin when the Johnson administration ruthlessly put a lie before the country and then invaded Vietnam on the basis of that piece of dishonesty. And we fought it. For a very brief period, 1 year, I was in the State Department. And what I witnessed there were very good young and older people trying to do things to help, quote, the third world. And they'd come up with actually very good programs. And by the time the stuff hit the ground, the corporations had ripped it to shreds and turned it into just another way to support corporate exploitation. And one of the other piece of that puzzle, as some of you know, I've written a great deal about the use of violence in the third world, particularly the bombing of Hiroshima and how that was part of an imperial structure of policy. My lesson from that is what we Americans can do most of all is to change this system to get off the backs of other people as a precondition of the mass global struggle. And that if we don't do that, what we'll see is more war, more exploitation, more use, more support of corporate investment abroad. And that is the place where our highest leverage is, to alter the structures in this system that are destroying possibilities around the world. So that, I think, is our part. That's my own view of our biggest part of the struggle globally.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's take some questions from the audience. We have 15 minutes for this. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I want to go back to something that actually is a theme that's going throughout, and it actually includes Professor White, which is the city. The city as a space for both possibility, but also a space of struggle. You mentioned Cleveland, and unfortunately what comes to mind around Cleveland right now is the $6 million that the Cleveland city is now going to have to pay out to Tamir Rice's family for the shooting of Tamir Rice. This is the settlement that has just been paid by the city of Cleveland. So under the neoliberal market understanding, right, that also includes a policing structure, the city is a really key point where a lot of this turns around, and how the various tentacles, if I want to call them that, of the neoliberal system that we're trying to think beyond are acting in concert and against one another, right? So my question goes back to trying to reclaim hope in the city, right, as something that's been mentioned a couple of times. And I go to an urban planner and thinker and poet, June Jordan, who always said that the city is where diversity rubs up against each other, right? June Jordan was a poet, an African-American poet, teacher, architect, brilliant mind. Again, San Francisco is where she passed away. But my question goes back to, if we think about diversity, or we think about the kind of tensions around that we have, are there other alternatives, more than just saying we need more multiculturalism? Because we've had some multiculturalism around for a long time, and it has been exploited by neoliberal markets. So that's, I guess, my question, and how the city would play into the possibilities. And I'm thinking about the beloved community as thought by Ross Baraka, another really big politician that's working towards thinking through potentially what he's calling a new Marshall Plan for urban centers in the United States, due to the fact that we have a shift of migration in the United States away from suburbs into cities, and how cities are going to be now a point where all of this rubbing is going to happen, and some of it is very violent, but some of it can be very productive. And that's the thing I want us to think about a little bit.
Well, you know, the cities are where the people are, period. I mean, that's not, obviously there are parts of the country where that's not the rural areas, but the concentrations of the population are in the cities. So that's where a lot of the struggle has to be. And what I think we're seeing is attempts, I mean, there's attempts to take on the ruthless police problem, primitive attempts, but beginning attempts to take that on, Black Lives Matter was the leading example of that. There are real attempts to begin to build different institutions from the bottom up. The community ownership, the worker ownership, the land trust, these are all experiments in trying to build some forms of structural solidarity, some forms. And we're in the prehistory, we're not in the history of it. We're building these fragments that we begin to give ideas in more sophistication, trial and error, failures, planning systems like the one where you've got these universities and hospitals that can't leave. They're anchored, and they've got a lot of public money. How do you get that money into supporting different change in the community? That's a political problem, political and an organizing problem. But these are all preliminaries in a sense. So I see the struggle, and I think that's where a lot of people are focused, because that's where the action is. So I see that as really, really interesting. One of the things, I was talking to someone from Sonoma recently, and I've been talking about structure primarily, trying to socialize structures, land trusts, worker-owned co-ops, different forms of transforming and bringing a new idea into being in fragmentary forms. We was talking about starting at the community organizing end. In a community where there was a possibility of building more solidarity over time, he suggested. and using that as the base to return to structure. Because it wasn't structural, it's primarily organizational, cultural, small business, et cetera, but trying to use that as the base of organizing structure, ownership structures, and moving up. So I think that's the developmental period in which we're working, and also at the national level when the big crises hit, there are possibilities. I don't think we're further than that, except there's a political struggle opening up. There's a movement opening up, beginning in the political realm per se, beginning to demand things per se. So these things, I think, have to come together, the experimentation, the model, the theory, and the struggle part. That's where we are. We're no further. But the period, I think this is the most, as I said, the most important period, in my view, of American history, bar none, including the American Revolution, because we're coming to the end of a systemic solution, and people are beginning to open up a very, very different kind of struggle at all these different levels. So I can't go further than that, except to say one thing: it is a personal struggle too for everybody in this room. That is to say, looking in the mirror in the morning, are you going to play or not?
Yeah.
It's an existential question. Are you or are you not going to play? Are you going to watch the movie go by, or are you going to be playing in the game and get in there and struggle with it? I think it comes down to that in the end, whether you're actually willing to actually do something.
I just want to say one quick response. Thank you for your question. This issue of looking in the mirror and working through your own alienation through a vision of being part of some collective project, right, towards, collective emancipation has to be the answer. And that's part of the answer. And that's why I brought up this issue of personal alienation, the stranger within, recognizing that individual and seeing it in the other. In this case, that was brought up, Tamir Rice. I'm glad you brought this up, because this deeply pisses me off. And the next system or series of systems has to deal with the issue of reparations. Now, when I say reparations, all of these solidarity economies are structural, smaller, experimental, jazz-oriented versions of structural reparations. But the issue with Tamir, right, and his murder is that we're paying off his family, which is a capitalist model, right, for his life. So this is biopolitics at its core, right? This individual child was murdered, we pay him off, and then that's it, right? So this is sort of the challenge with reparations, right? Of course his family should receive something, right? But then what else? What else? What structurally is left besides case law? I'm talking about what else is left that contributes to collective emancipation, and beyond the $6 million, which is a capitalist model of trying to say, here, now shut up. And it just deeply pains me, this issue. Clyde Woods, the late Clyde Woods, who was in the Black Studies Department before I joined the Black Studies Department, developed this idea of a blues epistemology. What if we use a blues epistemology, way of knowing, epistemology, way of understanding what we're struggling with, okay? If we develop a blues epistemology to understand what is the next system through the issue of Tamir Rice, right? Or through the reality that in India, there are cooperative type or collective sharing, informal collective sharing, but people are still struggling and being dispossessed, right? And moved and displaced, right? It's real. Where is the militant political education? Where is it? What if all of us saw each other as lobbyists for militant political education? And we went into elementary schools and worked with public school teachers as lobbyists for militant political education. Right? And we saw that as a cooperative. Sorry, I just started going off on. Next questions. Next question. You have this one, and then over there in the back.
I have a question for Mr. Aberovitz. As you know, in some of the major corporations in Germany, half of the board of directors are actually workers in the corporation. I'm not sure how that happened. There had to be some kind of chartering or some kind of way that the corporations could be structured that way, that appears to me to be a possibility towards moving towards a better system in our corporate structure. If half of the board is actually concerned about the environment, is concerned about, moving jobs out of that particular community, the community is more stable. But it's hard for me to see how we could make that happen in the United States and what it would take to do it. So I'd like to hear your comments on how that could be a part of building a better system.
I'm not particularly partial to that solution. I think you do get some concern for keeping jobs in the community from the co-determination models. But what I basically think happens is that the workers get sucked into the capitalist model and that they have to exploit and support the corporation, making more and more profits. So I see it as a kind of narrow, ultimately a dead end. I think you're going to have. I think we have to move towards essentially a community and a different vision of socialism that doesn't drive on profits. Those corporations must make profits. They must externalize costs to pollute the environment to the extent necessary, because if they don't, they will be destroyed in the market. And you buy the workers into that process. I don't myself think that's a good direction to go into.
Yeah, I fully agree with Gar that it's deceptive when that happens, but it's a good question that you brought up, and so maybe it's worth thinking about how it happened in the first place, and also where we should go and so on. I'm not an expert on Germany, what happened in Germany, but I can say just in general, the reason you see some slightly different structures and in some ways dramatically different outcomes, social outcomes for people in Europe so far, what you've seen is a consequence of just phenomenal labor movements, as you were talking about militant labor movements in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there were those, as Emily said, there were those movements in the United States too. There's a rich history of really courageous labor movements in the United States. In fact, the sit-in strike, the idea of sit-in strike, to my knowledge, was really developed by American workers. And but for various reasons that I wouldn't have time to get into, the trajectory of labor movements was slightly different, and as I said, led to dramatically different outcomes than in Europe. And they were many of those labor movements were led by socialists, and it never went far enough because it remained within the framework of capitalism. So again, I wouldn't call Sweden or Norway, as many people think, they're not socialist countries, they're social democracies under capitalism. In other words, the movements of working class people have succeeded historically in achieving a measure of social welfare that is accessible to a broader base of people in the country than it was possible in the US. Although in the US too, the things that we do have, like Social Security, like whatever funding there was for public education, those are elements that socialists talk about, and the reason they came into being was because those movements were led by socialists, and they succeeded in winning certain reforms, but it didn't go far enough, in my view, that we have to actually dismantle capitalism itself. And part of also why it happened at that time also has to do with the period of capitalism itself. In the wake of the Second World War, there was a potential for growth, and capitalism was experiencing a certain growth rate that allowed, and in some sense this sounds strange if I say this as a socialist, but in some sense it allowed the capitalist class to give a certain degree of concessions to the working class. And when I say that, I don't mean that they did it out of the goodness of their heart. It was a massive struggle, but the fact is that the GDP growth rate, the growth rate under capitalism, which is necessary for capitalism, was at such a degree that it was possible for the capitalist class to keep amassing profits and more profits every year while giving a little bit of concession more. So public education was funded and workers' councils were formed so that workers could feel that they were in control, but they're not actually in control. And what this really shows, in my view, is that capitalism is an incredibly malleable system. It has the ability to adapt itself. If struggles are on the ascendancy, it has the ability to absorb some of those struggles, give a certain concession. You know, $15 an hour in Seattle was a concession. The reason there was a concession was because we as 15 Now campaign had filed a ballot initiative that was threatening the ruling class of Seattle, that if they didn't concede through an ordinance of the city council, they would have to, we would end up winning a ballot initiative that was a much stronger measure of 15. So that's the dynamic of power that plays into when we are fighting against capitalism. But that is why I would say that at the end of the day, if we want to empower workers really and make a transformative change, then we have to fight against capitalism itself. And also, to the theme that has been running in our discussion today, if we just picked one thing, like ending hunger, the reason I'm saying that we need a political upheaval is because we cannot really end hunger. This is just one example. I can come up with many examples. We cannot really end hunger unless there are resources at our disposal to end hunger. Right now, in every continent of the globe, there are granaries that have grain rotting in them, and I'm somewhat speaking metaphorically, but you know what I mean. There is so much food that is going to waste, but there is no mechanism within our system to make that food available to the people who are hungry. And that is why unless we have a political clash, and I don't mean like violence, the violence comes from the top to the bottom. What we launch are non-violent movements, but they have to be a struggle that are very clear, that this is what we are fighting against. And just in terms of concreteness, we're having this discussion in an incredible moment, and I'm going to bring up something that may not be necessarily directly linked to the question of next system, but it is linked to the moment we are speaking in. At this moment, it is very likely that Hillary Clinton will become the nominee of she is the presumptive nominee. Bernie Sanders, despite the fact that tens of millions of people in the heartland of America are responding to his call for a political revolution, is not going to be the nominee. And that the reason is not because he does not have the mandate of voters. The problem is that he's running with a party that does not support him. The reason I won is that my party supports me and fought for me. It's a very simple, but very important contradiction to point out. So I would say, just lastly, sorry that I'm going on, but just a very important point is that at this moment, concretely, the question that stares us in the face is, all this momentum, all these young people who have become politicized and radicalized for the first time in their lives, where are they going to go? What is the political home for this new ferment that has started? We have to talk about this concretely. And so I would say, from our end, from Socialist Alternative, the organization, the political organization I belong to, I'm not a free-floating activist. It's important to be organized in an organization. And through Socialist Alternative, we launched Movement for Bernie, which called for the Million Student March, which, as you know, was highly successful, and you had the biggest success here. We have launched a petition urging Bernie to run all the way through November as an independent if necessary. And we're also talking about the need for an independent party of the 99%. I have no illusions. We have no illusion that this will happen in one day. But it's a question, as Gar and Emily and others were saying, it's a question of direction. So concretely, what is the direction that we can talk about at this moment while we are discussing what the next system should look like? I think that not losing that momentum, not letting it just dissipate into demoralization and maybe I was involved in my campus, but now I'm going to focus on my career. If you want to avoid that and have young people continue to be politicized and radicalized, then there have to be concrete avenues like that. So I would urge you all to go to movementforbernie.org and sign the petition so that we already have 15,000 signatures. I don't think Bernie is going to run as an independent. That's not the point. The point is getting a dialogue started with the millions of people who have come alive through this campaign.
Are there any ending comments you would like to make?
I guess what I would say is that to make this change, to make this transformation, we need to think about building an ecosystem. And it takes all parts. So it is that resist and build. I think that there's good work going on in all these levels. And we should recognize each other as being part of the same project of transformation. And sometimes there's a little tendency to expect everybody to be working on the same thing. But I think in an ecosystem, you do need to have different groups occupying different niches and working together, and creating that ecosystem is sort of where we're at, right? The work is going on, but understanding that there are different niches and then building it in a way that it's actually working together is the real challenge.
And with that, we've gone over a little bit, but please help me in thanking this amazing panel. Thank you so much.